This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. To learn more or to subscribe, visit beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew. It's podcast episode 309, and this is the third and final panel discussion recorded at our Brewers Retreat a few weeks ago. And while this panel focuses on West Coast IPA and was recorded at Russian River's Windsor, California brewery, it doesn't include Vinny Cilurzo. He was off giving half of the group a personal brewery tour at the same time that we did this panel discussion. It does include some real heavyweights in the world of IPA brewing, like Matt Brynildson of Firestone Walker, Sean Lawson of Lawson's Finest, and a recent Russell Share Award winner, Ben Edmunds of Breakside Brewing. All three have appeared in the podcast before, but I couldn't pass up the opportunity to have all three pick each other's brains about IPA. And if you listen to episode 300 of the podcast, you know that Ben definitely has some great questions. All three breweries have been stretching out in the IPA realm over the past couple of years, exploring new ideas, ingredients, and techniques to make engaging hop-forward beers. And we spent some time exploring how each of these breweries find space within the West Coast IPA genre to brew multiple beers with varying approaches, like Firestone Walker's launch of the Hopnosis brand using cold IPA brewing techniques. As with other panels we've shared, you all listening out there won't get to taste the beers we poured to go along with the discussion. But if you'd like to try to follow along at home, try seeking out some Firestone Walker No Vacancy. And that's their Firestone Walker Invitational collaboration beer they did with Alvarado Street, along with some Breakside West Coast Best Coast and Lawson's iconic Double Sunshine. As with earlier panels, there are some questions out there from folks in the audience. I know Ken Grossman was vocal in this one too. If they're inaudible in the audio, I'll try to repeat them so you understand what people are asking in there, and we will go forward in that kind of way. It's too good to not share all of this. We're going to jump into the conversation in a second, but first, for years, G&D Chillers has chilled the beers you love, partnering with 3,000 plus breweries across the country. They're proud of the cool partnerships they've built, offering 24/7 service and support. G&D builds with non-proprietary parts, expert craftsmanship, and constant innovation. G&D's in-house engineering crew have been piping breweries, wineries, and distilleries for over 30 years. They offer free piping design and consultation with the sale of every chiller they build. Reach out for a quote today at gdchillers.com or call to discuss your next project. Also, today's podcast is sponsored by BSG. When planning your next brewing journey, consider traveling domestically with your malt choice. As distributors of quality domestic malts like Rahr and Gambrinus, BSG gives you the freedom to explore a world of flavors, but at local prices. So you can cut costs, but not quality. Start exploring at bsgcraftbrewing.com. And if you hear Old Orchard mentioned in the brewing community, don't be surprised. The flavored craft juice concentrate blends from Old Orchard have shipped to over 46 states. Their new brewing customers often mention discovering Old Orchard through the word-of-mouth recommendation of another brewer. To join the core of Old Orchard's brewing community, learn more at oldorchard.com/brewer. Now let's jump into the discussion on brewing West Coast IPA. Maybe we'll start off with you, Ben. We'll just kind of have a broader discussion about how you define West Coast IPA, what you think about when you think about IPA, what your goals are when brewing it, and then maybe a little bit of how that has evolved over the last decade of Breakside, and how you have developed this IPA and where it's going now.
For sure, yeah. As far as like when Breakside started, I think that West Coast IPA was already kind of the dominant trend in the Northwest. In the West Coast for sure. It was a no-brainer to have that as a flagship beer from day one. So when we first started brewing at Breakside, I had come from a small brewery that actually didn't do an IPA. We were doing mainly Saison and farmhouse style beers. So my IPA background was kind of informed more by what I had just tasted in the marketplace or at GABF and things like that. And so I was trying to triangulate a little bit between what I saw as kind of these marketplace examples that were really world-class beers, whether those be Matt's beers or Vinny's beers, Ken's beers that I was familiar with, and then what the kind of Northwest palate was looking for, just a little bit different. And, a little bit at the time, I would say those beers were in the Northwest a little bit more pine forward, a little bit more, probably a little bit darker in color, a little bit more caramel malt influence in those beers at the time than what you were seeing in kind of the California vein. And so, of course, I think as we have evolved as a brewery and as IPA has changed, like we have embraced kind of a more pan-regional approach to brewing these beers, right? And so the beers have gotten lighter, they've gotten drier, the BUs have dropped. There's definitely some lessons to be taken away from East Coast IPA, hazy IPA that have come kind of to flow back into how we make our beers. But I would still say, like fundamentally, these are relatively well attenuated bitter beers. And, for us, that bitterness has come down, but to the average consumer, I always think that like if internally we say this beer is a little bit soft, it probably is actually hitting the sweet spot for our actual consumer as far as bitterness goes. So yeah, that's kind of just a broad overview, I'd say.
Sure. Matt, from your perspective, talk about how these things have changed. You all have been rolling out new IPA brands in the West Coast space while also maintaining a beautiful classic IPA in that same kind of space. Talk about how some of that innovation and development has happened and where you're finding new space in this broad family of West Coast IPA.
Yeah, so to talk origin story a little bit, Ken's in the room here. So the beer that I had a beat on when I was first designing IPA was Celebration Ale. And it was always like how can we capture a little bit of that magic in our initial IPAs? And then, you've heard the story a bunch of times, but Firestone Walker waited 10 years to launch our first official IPA, Union Jack. So by that time, we had the opportunity, like Ben said, to watch how it had evolved here on the West Coast. So yeah, Vinny was a big inspiration. There were a number of really great IPAs. So it was actually pretty easy. Again, this whole triangulating and picking the things that we liked and talking to brewers about the hops that were working really well for them. And at that time, we're talking 2006, the new hops on the scene were Amarillo, Simcoe, and Citra had just come out. That was the hot rod. And so we had to play with these new hops, and that made it pretty straightforward. I always say that IPA is in our wheelhouse, so anytime we're asked to, generate a new IPA recipe, it's kind of, it's a lot of fun. And for us, it's really focusing on new hop cultivars and how to integrate them into the beers. And you mentioned the East Coast kind of juicy, hazy IPA having a really profound influence on how we're making West Coast now, because we're using some of those hops for a little different end. But we've been able to kind of elevate that tropical character in these beers. And just like everybody, you're looking at this beer right now, it's like West Coast IPA went from being a somewhat amber beer with obviously a specialty malt element that was pretty profound in its flavor profile to something that's, really Pilsner malt driven, oftentimes adjuncted to even accentuate the dryness and the focus of those beers. And as a result, we've lowered, of course, the bitterness, and the hops just explode off of that canvas. So it's really fun. In my head, I think of, it's almost Pilsner beer. It's a stronger Pilsner beer, but it's almost like a Pilsner beer base with a lot of American hop punch.
How about you, Sean?
I'll start with a confession. I'm a hophead. So that's how I got into brewing IPAs. It's kind of funny for me to sit on a panel talking about West Coast IPA. As you know, I'm in Vermont. So about almost as far east and north as you can get. And so the IPAs for me, I started as a home brewer for many years, and certainly gravitated towards West Coast style, drier, snappier, more bitter IPAs. And from the beginning, I really liked the lighter color profile, not a lot of color malts, not a lot of Caramunic or caramel, but I use a little bit of those in our flagship IPAs. It's funny because I don't know if we're bipolar or we're not clear on our identity, but we've never classified our IPAs, and so Sip of Sunshine, which is our flagship, comes in at 8%. It's a pretty similar color to this, but it's been written about as one of the early forerunners in the New England or juicy hazy style, but it looks pretty darn clear these days compared to what hazy is defined as, or New England style. So I would say, well, I never considered Sip of Sunshine a New England style IPA, but it is an IPA brewed in New England. And so
This is why we drafted you for this panel and not the one after this.
Yeah, I don't know the first thing about hazy IPAs except you can't see through them. So, but I could describe them, and ironically, having been cited as one of the early New England style IPAs, we just launched one that we've branded as hazy, a hazy race, right around 5%, real soft on the palate, low bitterness. But we tried to steer clear of the sort of chewy vegetal character that you get out of a lot of the hazies out there that are maybe not as well put together. For me, always approached IPAs as how much aroma and flavor can I pack into the beer while still making it balanced. And like you guys, the same inspirational beers, Sierra Nevada, the beers that Vinny makes here, and some of the other smaller West Coast breweries that were doing IPAs inspired me. Sort of what I would call our West Coastiest of IPAs celebrates the dank and the pine, and that's our Chinookard, Chinook, Columbus, Centennial. But it's a Chinook forward beer. I wouldn't describe it as catty, but some people do. I certainly don't want cat piss in my beer, but it's dank, and it has a lot of cannabis-like qualities to it too, but it's super snappy. It's got a real sharp bite to it, but it uses just a little bit more color malts to make it all balanced. At the end of the day, that's the key as I approach putting together an IPA, is balancing out the residual sweetness that you get out of the beer with the level of bitterness. So.
Cool. So everyone has a glass of beer, right? This is one of Ben's beers. This first beer is West Coast Best Coast. Is that it, right?
West Coast Best Coast.
West Coast Best Coast. Figured that would be the right thing to start this panel off with. So Ben, this is a really light beer, very, very light, and very fruit forward in its flavor. Definitely has some of that kind of little bits of that Pacific Northwest dankness in there, just to give it some structure. But talk to all of us about what your thinking was in designing this and how you went about designing this particular beer, which is so light. Also,
thank you. This West Coast Best Coast is about 7.2, 7.3% beer. Basically goes, and we have lots of beers in our portfolio, so I have to have my cheat sheet here, But basically it runs from about 15.5 Plato down to 2.5 Plato, and I think has been discussed on the podcast. I'm also an adherent to this belief that regardless of ABV, like all of our hop forward beers finish in this 2.2 to 2.7 range. That's kind of the sweet spot. And, if it's too high, then we notice it. And if it's too dry, I think it just cuts the hop flavor short, and the beer's a little bit rough and bitter. 2.5 is kind of a nice target for this beer. It's one that we've made for about 3 years. It is a mix of Great Western Two-Row and their Pure Idaho, which is a Pilsner malt out of their Pocatello facility. Very light. I think it's 1.4, 1.5 Lovemont malt or SRM malt, Lovemont malt. And then there's a small amount of Vienna in here as well, just to kind of, I like the use of Vienna and Munich and some character malts in IPAs to this day. Obviously, it doesn't impart a tremendous amount of color, but what I think it does is oftentimes will kind of push those beers directionally. The hop presentation goes from a little bit more green and underripe toward a little bit more ripe, kind of overripe fruit, which is something we seek in those beers. A little bit of dextrose in there to kind of get fermentation, really turbocharge it a little bit. And then, Mosaic CO2 extract late in the kettle, and then after that, it's kind of the modern trinity, I guess, of Citra, Mosaic, Strata, and then that's through the late kettle and Whirlpool, as well as then a Citra addition right at cast out, and then dry hopped with those same hops plus a charge of Nelson. That's dry hopped over 2 different additions, and that's kind of the basics of the beer. I mean, it's really, I think for us, this is a pretty good example of where most of our IPAs are these days, which is we tend to favor things that are more in the 7% vein. a little bit lighter in color, and have a big kind of like a double dry hop to get that aroma to really pop in that second one.
You talked about using extract.
Yeah.
Talk about using advanced hop products and how you found you can best use them. I mean, obviously there's cost, there's performance, there's yield, there's also intensity. There are a lot of different motivations for using those, and there are different ways the brewers are using them. How have you found in using some of these advanced hop products that you're getting either the best impact, the most intensity, or finding other functional benefits from them?
Yeah, I'd say that for us, the two key pieces, we're usually using them kind of as a late kettle addition, around 10 minutes before end of boil. It's not a huge amount of BUs for us, usually in the I'd say 10 to 20 BU range, those size charges. But one is, I just find the bitterness from these to be very, very clean, right? I think it's a much just kind of there's not a lot of textural or kind of auxiliary bitterness coming from the use of extracts. CO2 extract in particular, and I really like that. And second, I actually think that the BU stability on it is a little bit better as well. So we don't see as much of a drop in our wort BU to our finished beer BU as we do with an all T90 kettle. So yeah, those are kind of the main pieces. I think there's probably some additional bits about fan if we want to go down that route and talk about kind of impact to longer term stability and freshness. But for now, I would just say that for me, the use of it there's a yield benefit as well, but mainly is that I just like the cleanliness, the bitterness on it.
I want to pick Matt's brain on the same subject of advanced hop products while we're talking, because you're a hop scientist of sorts.
In a former life.
Yeah.
We'll be back in a second with more of the panel, but first, take your brewing to the next level with AccuBrew's revolutionary fermentation monitoring system, now predicting specific gravity. With AccuBrew, you'll have precise control over the fermentation process and ensure consistent, high-quality results. Their cloud-based app and compact sensor work together to monitor specific gravity, fermentation activity, clarity, and temperature. AccuBrew is CIP ready and designed to stay out of your way. Their set it and forget it solution streamlines systems and processes, confirms consistency, and helps detect problems before they ruin a batch. Join the AccuBrew community today and experience 24/7 peace of mind. Visit accubrew.io to learn more. Also, brewing is currently one of the most innovative, adaptive, and fast-paced industries in the world. With consumer demand shifting to the latest and greatest trend, it can be difficult for production teams to keep up with requirements. The ProFill series of rotary can fillers from ProBrew are accelerating plant production everywhere. These can fillers run at speeds between 100 and 600 plus cans per minute, while achieving precise and consistent filling volumes not achievable by most inline and mobile fillers. For more information, visit www.probrew.com or email contact@probrew.com to learn exactly how they can take your operations to the next level. ProBrew, brew your beer. And did you know your water can change the flavor profile of your beer? Water is the number one ingredient after all, and uswatersystems.com knows just how to treat it. uswatersystems.com has been at the forefront of the craft brewing industry and created American-made water treatment systems with brewers in mind. Whether you're a hobbyist or a pro, head on over to uswatersystems.com to learn more, because great beer starts here. Now, back to the panel. How have you been, finding using advanced hop products, extracts, flowable, and then, of course, concentrated pellets, cryo, Lupamax, and whatnot. Where have you found, that the sweet spot lies for you? Is it variety specific? Are there some that you like in different formats other than others? Is there a timing, drive and where and when you're using that is helping make some of those decisions about how you use them?
I might be a little bit old school on the CO2 extract side of things, because I think we always would use it. We would deploy it as our first bittering charge.
Initial charge, yeah.
Yeah, and not think about using it typically until late, but just to start with CO2 extract. So we've always had it in our hop closet, and it's typically been deployed into the really high IBU beers. And early on, when Union Jack, we were trying to obtain like a real 75 IBU finished analytical, we had to use it to get there, or we would just jam the kettle up with too much vegetative matter. And then in other lighter styles, we tend to use it for the same reason: a nice, clean, reliable bitterness, and then we can feather some other aroma hops in later. So real traditional use of CO2 extract. And I would say in the early days, we leaned heavily on Magnum, because that was somewhat, famous or well-known amongst German brewers for clean bitterness, and we were finding the same result. And then more recently, we kind of have a program in our brewery. If we have overages, if we have older hops that we haven't gotten through, we'll actually have those extracted, and then we'll use those as our. So we kind of have a bit of a mix of hops in our current CO2 extract that we use in the brewery. And then more recently, and what this beer demonstrates a little bit is some of our more recent tinkering around with the flowable products. Incognito in particular here. This beer has Mosaic Incognito. And so Sam at the Propagator is getting to experiment a lot more with what you've discussed in your previous podcasts about using it even on the cold side and doing some of the things that North Park is doing. But in this beer, it's used as the directions would tell you to use it in the whirlpool. And in that case, it's a little more like what you were talking about. You get this fairly reliable, it's pre-isomerized, so you get a pretty reliable bitterness from its use. And then you get this, full hop aroma character that carries through. And I've done some collaborations in some other breweries. We did a collaboration with Beechwood where we used kind of an obnoxious amount of Incognito in the whirlpool. And my observation, I was a little shocked because when we dumped it in on that system, it just created this oil slick on the whirlpool top, and then my head automatically goes to, where's that all going to go? Are we going to get that in the fermenter? Or is it just going to stick to the sidewall of the vessels? And I start worrying. I get a little frantic about consistency there. Whereas on our brewery, we have a hop dosing vessel, and I found that product really suits itself well to that because, and I'm not sure if any probably doesn't have it on this system. I don't recall, but anyway, we actually pour the hop product into a vessel and then recirculate through that vessel into the kettle, and there's no oil slick. It all goes into solution, and we seem to get really good utilization with that particular application. So, not to take up too much airtime on.
Oh no, sure. Sean, do you have any use advanced hop products?
Pretty limited use in our brewery. The extracts, same way that Matt traditionally used them. We use them more at the front end of higher BU beer, and then we have been using more of the concentrated hop product, the cryo pellet, or Lupomax, and typically utilize those in the whirlpool or in dry hopping as well. So the big benefit there is just cutting down on the amount of vegetative material, better yield, and I think a cleaner bitterness that we get out of it. And if we have time, I'd be curious to hear from the panel too about like timing and approach process-wise on dry hopping, because that's evolved a lot over the years as
For
well.
sure.
Yep.
I want to talk about coming up with hop blends and your creative process around that as well as that. But I also don't want to dominate all the questions. If you guys have any questions, just throw a hand up and we'll get them. And I know Dick's in the back there. I'm sure he can come up with some good questions for you too. The beer that's coming out now is No Vacancy. Matt, you were talking about using some new and fun hops in that one. Let's use that as an entree to discuss creative process around building hop blends.
Yeah, and so this one I can, whether you like it or not, I can totally just blame JC Hill at Alvarado Street because this was a collaboration with Alvarado Street, and we've kind of gotten this cool rhythm with our collabs where we really ask the brewery that we're working with to give us the recipe that we'll then play with later. So this is really a riff on Mai Tai more than anything, it's brewed much more like Mai Tai than a typical Firestone IPA. So it's pretty much a mosaic beer, almost all the way through. I think there was a little bit of CO2 extract for the initial bittering charge, but then everything after that was mosaic. And we used all of the forms of mosaic. So we used T90 concentrated pellets and Incognito in this beer. And bitterness is, I think the target was between 45 and 50. So low by IPA standards, but still a snappy bitterness. And we used a combination of cryo and T90 in the kettle to get there. But then it had this big Incognito charge in the whirlpool. So we got an amazing yield as a result because there just wasn't a lot of hop matter on the hot side. I mean, still IPA, so there's a fair amount in those middle charges, but because there was a CO2 extract in the front end and the incognito in the back end. It was a really good yield. Low color, again, it's almost all base malt and just a touch of wheat for foam and for, what all the nice things wheat does, but it's such a low charge. I don't know that has a massive impact on the flavor. And then we did a mid-ferm. It's a really early, I almost say almost like I think it was 12 hours or something, 16 hours into the fermentation. It was a relatively aggressive, I think it was at least a pound of cryo mosaic that went in and was in that beer for the whole fermentation. And then, we do little baby dumps out the bottom of the tank or pop burps. What do we call those? I can't remember. There's some proper
shaves, right?
Oh, shaves.
Shaving
Yeah.
the tank.
I got to get with the
Shaving
program
cone,
here.
Yeah. We don't use the term dump.
Shave.
No.
Sorry. So we shaved off the bottom during the fermentation, and then do a proper shave before the final dry hop. Nice clean shave. Yeah. Apparently I don't. Yeah. So and that was with T90 mosaic in the finish. So it kind of has a little bit of everything in there, and I think expresses mosaic really nicely.
Yeah.
Matt, were these all selected lots of mosaic? Are you blending? Like, is it all the T90 one lot of mosaic? Or are you guys combining multiple lots of mosaic?
Yeah, what's cool in our brewery is both our T90 and our cryo were our selected hops.
Yeah.
And the incognito wasn't, however. That was what was stock. Yeah.
Out of curiosity, like why is it simply just for efficiency in the brew house that you're using all of these different formats?
Well,
or do you find that they express in different kinds of ways?
That's probably a better question for JC, who was, the one that was dictating these charges.
Okay.
But I can walk you through our logic a little bit on this beer. Was that the cryo mid-ferm, and that seems to work really well for us because there's less vegetative material that's being churned up in this fermentation. Sometimes when we've done those at large charges mid-ferm with T90s, they get a little gritty and pellety, I call it. A little too much of the vegetative character. So it seems to work well in that application. Taking a step back, the incognito. It's still a downstream product. So to me, having worked in a hop lab, it still smells like hop extract to me. Like it's been manhandled a little bit, but it gives a really clean hop expression. And it's distinct. So, I think when you were talking to the folks at North Park, that's kind of become the house character, right? Mm-hmm. So there is a distinctive note there. But then there's also something about just 90, and you've heard this from other brewers. I've never done an all cryo beer, so I can't really speak to it, but we've always blended some T90s in when we're using cryo to get some of that whole hop expression.
Let's also follow up on this, and we can now use this to talk about Sean's subject of dry hopping, because early mid-fermentation dry hopping in a West Coast IPA seems a little bit counterintuitive, especially if you're using, typical West Coast yeast. What do you gain from doing that versus a post-fermentation, dry hopping after terminal?
I don't know. I think there's this kind of like idea of trying to pack as much hop character into the beer as you possibly can. And for us anyway, with mid-ferm cryo dry hops, we tend to get this really saturated hop expression. Like it's just, sewn into the beer. And I'm sure through that fermentation, you've scrubbed off some of the myrcene and some of the real light oils. So you get away from some of that character. And that's my best way of expressing that, I guess.
Because if it's still fermenting, you're still pushing CO2
You're
out
scrubbing
of the liquid,
a lot of hop oil off. There's no doubt about it. Yeah,
but maybe it's the bad stuff. That's what you're thinking.
Well, that's
Well, the less desirable for this specific
possibly.
beer.
I mean, beers that have just this massive captured myrcene character can be a little abrasive as well. Yeah.
Sure. What's your dry hop process look like, Sean?
I approach it pretty traditionally for American IPA brewers. So typically, most of our beers, we tend to let it fully ferment, try to get as much yeast dropped out of the beer before we start any dry hopping. And that'll do one or two charges. And once the beer's kind of cleaned up, cooled off a little bit. And that's evolved somewhat. Some of our newer beers, we've gotten into dry hopping earlier in the process, doing multiple dry hops during the fermentation. And I find it definitely with those, the biotransformations that happen, you just get a completely different sort of expression of the hop character when you add it during fermentation. I think you lose something adding it during the fermentation too. So I'm still a pretty big fan of cleaning up the beer and adding it later, but we've evolved to the customer's palate too, because a lot of people really like that, the softness that you get when you add it with all the yeast up in suspension and it's still fermenting.
Sure. How about you, Ben? How's dry hopping been evolving for you all in West Coast IPA?
I mean, to be honest, our method has been pretty consistent over the years. And there's a number of beers we do that are single charge dry hops, kind of at day 5, day 6. We've done cast out hops or hop dipping, if that's the term that people are still using, in a number of beers over the years, usually ones that we don't have to harvest yeast from. And then, of course, double dry hop charges on bigger beers. I think if we've evolved anything, it's only to do more dry hops on regular strength IPAs, or even now kind of even some of our session IPAs or pale ales we'll do 2 dry hops, and a lot of that's varietal specific. I think that one of the things for us and why we choose to do, say, 1 dry hop or 2, or the timing of things, is a little bit about trying to navigate the rough edges of some hops. Galaxy is a good example of this, where we've just found that if we can get our Galaxy the shortest contact time possible into a beer, we can get the flavor out of it in 48 hours. We avoid a lot of the kind of woody. I always describe it as, we have one brewer who describes it tastes like black ants. I guess he ate black ants as a kid. So if that maybe resonates for some people, but this kind of very woody type flavor that is a little harsh and undesirable with that hop in particular. And I think actually a number of New Zealand hops we tend to favor doing a little bit later, just to try and kind of get a lot of fruit and not a lot of additional attributes from them. A lot of the time, what we're looking for with that second dry hop will often just be kind of top note punch at the end. It'll be a very quick contact, 48 hours. We leave the tank open, so we're not capping at that point. So if there is any residual hop creep that's happening, we get through it relatively quickly. We're adding ALDC at the time of that second dry hop as well, and that's helped at least keep any diacetyl spikes down. We found that this is also happening on a relatively well-attenuated beer at that point, so we're not seeing a lot of change in the gravity after that second dry hop, if only maybe 0.1 degree Plato. But really, I view that second addition as kind of your top note, your punch, that last bit to get some of those delicate flavors through. And hopefully, to Matt's point, we've layered in enough other hop flavor from the kettle through the whirlpool through an earlier fermentation dry hop to have a base that we're really just adding on top of, and we're not relying on that last addition to carry the weight of the entire beer.
Yeah, and I would add, now that you mention it, that if anything, that mid-firm hop addition, you're getting some of that enzyme that's responsible for hop creep in early, and those fermentations seem to be much more consistent. There's a much less, if any, of the creep out at the end. And then I totally agree with you on the top note, especially with the Southern Hemisphere. We found that for sure with Hopnosis. We're spending all this money on these New Zealand hops, and we use them as very special top note for the last dry hop, and it's a real short contact time as well.
Yeah, let's talk about that a little bit on that creative side. What are those hops?
Can I add one other thing about the dry hopping? Just sorry, because I know this has come up in a few podcasts. So we don't cell count anymore on day 5, but we found our sweet spot on this is 30 million cells in suspension. Huh. So we've harvested at this point. We're a Chico brewery, so thank you, Ken. So we're harvesting and then dry hopping the same day or the next day, and it's usually right around that I guess it'd be about 120 hours and 30 million cells in suspension. And we found that's we just get a really consistent profile from that. I don't know why we chose that number. There was not. It was more just we liked the results from that. So, are you guys? I think didn't Vinny ask you that?
Yeah, and I'm gonna have a hard time remembering the exact numbers, but I think we have a little more flocculent yeast, and so our number tends to be a little bit lower than that, and not as consistent as I maybe would like to see. In other words, whether or not we can really get a consistent cell count at that point from our sampling valves where they're located in the tank, which is pretty low on a pretty large format tank just above the cone, but I think it's maybe closer to the 20 million cell range. We definitely want some yeast and a little bit of yeast activity just for oxygen control. I think that was always more of my thinking. And I also was thinking in terms of this potential biotransformation, although I didn't at the time necessarily understand the mechanism for sure. I just liked the character of the hops when there's some yeast present, and maybe just a little bit, half a degree Plato fermentation left to go.
We'll have to talk to Scott, my director of brewing. We've never looked at cell counts in terms of where we're at in the process with dry hopping. And I'd also, I just add that quantities are really important too. And so we've played around quite a bit on our pilot system and even some of the production brews, just little tweaks at a time, because you do get a pretty rapidly diminishing return. And when you're brewing in volume, like whether you add another quarter or half a pound of hops per barrel is a pretty significant cost impact on the finished beer. So, if you're a home brewer or a really small brewery, there's quite a bit more latitude you have in adding 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. You just keep adding the numbers, pounds per barrel. But we tend to stay pretty low on the range from what I've heard from some of the smaller breweries that we've done collaborations with, generally in that like 1 to 2 pounds per barrel. 2 would be pretty darn high for us for dry hopping.
So civilized.
Yeah. Just didn't find we got any better results going higher than that, at least to my palate, to the type of beers that we were looking to produce.
I agree with that to some degree, Sean, which is that I think that we moved. It wasn't until we regularly started doing 2 dry hops and doing dual stage dry hopping that I really felt like those higher poundages were worth it. And I think I've come around to think that actually when you're doing multiple charges, you do get more is more. Yeah. I mean, there's probably some upper limit to it, but we went high with our dry hops for a while, then we came back down. And then as we, honestly, for some reasons that had less to do with trying to up aroma, but more trying to reduce bitterness and just improve yield, we moved hops out of the kettle and out of the whirlpool into the dry hop, and found that the aroma started going up again with this 2-stage piece. So yeah, I think it's an interesting question of like, where do you hit those saturation points?
Are there other variables that you also adjusted, whether it's time and temperature, along with that 2-stage process?
We have always dry hopped at like 67 to 68 degrees. And actually, in the wintertime when our tanks drop in the brewery with the ambient temps, if it's like 64, like that means that we're going to see prolonged hop creep. So I'm very much a warm dry hop guy.
Yeah.
We tend to cool off our beers a little bit. That first dry hop we'll do at fermentation temperature. So 68, 70 degrees. And then we typically cool it off to 55 to get more of the yeast to drop out, especially when we're doing multi-stage dry hopping. And those I'd agree completely with Ben, where we've had the best results with higher hop rates is where you're adding it in multiple stages at different times during the process.
Sure. More from the panel in a minute, but first, no matter what you are canning, Twin Monkeys Beverage Systems has the solution. With a versatile lineup of quality canning and packaging equipment made in the USA, their troop is ready to customize a setup for your craft business. Need on-site training or help with installation? You got it. Visit twinmonkeys.net today to learn just how easy it is to get your craft into cans. Also, everybody knows that yeast plays one of the most important roles in brewing, no matter what style and recipe you choose. It influences flavor, aroma, acidity, brightness, and mouthfeel all at the same time. And brewing a lager is no exception. Discover a whole soft lager range by Fermentis, covering from traditional to modern style lagers. Soft Lager S189 for the elegant lagers with floral notes. Soft Lager S23 for fruity and hoppy ones. And Soft Lager W3470 for your neutral beers. Available in 500 grams, 100 grams, and 11.5 gram formats. Want to know more about Soft Lager yeasts? Visit www.fermentis.com. And ABS Commercial has been a full-service brewery outfitter for over 10 years. They're proud to offer brewhouses, tanks, keg washers, and small parts to brewers across the country, as well as equipment for distilling, cider making, wine making, and more. They know the ins and outs of the brewing and installation process and can design the perfect setup for you, whether you're just starting out or looking to expand. Contact them today at sales@abs-commercial.com to discuss your customized brewery needs. ABS Commercial, we are brewers. Now, back to the panel. I want to come back to something you said about top notes, and I'm curious about, as you're thinking about building a blend of hops with, through a beer, creating this experience, setting that base for that flavor as you talked about, but then hitting a top note kind of highlights, how do you think about and design those hop blends? Are there certain hops that you use to build that kind of, big round middle flavor? And which hops do you start leaning on to add those bright highlights? That's for all of you all.
I think it depends, right? I mean, we talk a little bit about the New Zealand and kind of Southern Hemisphere influence on top notes, and I think that's one that generally we lean on for a late edition, but it's not necessarily just for the top notes, more to avoid some of the grassy and woody attributes that can come from those hops if you let them sit too long. I think it really just depends year to year on our lots. Right now, we have a Mosaic cryo lot that's incredibly dank right now that I probably would not use for a top note just because it's too much, right? Even in a small amount, it's that's going to be something that we'll use in Whirlpool editions. We'll use it in kind of, day 5 dry hops, but not to push kind of end aromatics. But the year before we had a much more mango forward lot of Mosaic cryo. So that would have been one that we probably were using more in top note application. So I think it just depends. I mean, Citra is one that I immediately think of as always being great for a late burst. But, with a lot of these fruit forward hops, I think you see variability lot to lot that can push things more bass note or more treble, like high-low. And I think you have to know your raw materials.
I would echo that 100%. It really depends. And, in the early days, it was always this baseline of Cascade Centennial. And then we would just work off of that. So Union Jack's a great example of that. The brew house is predominantly Cascade Centennial, paying homage to Celebration Ale on the Centennial side, I think. And then we would layer in some of our more expressive hops in the second dry hop. And more recently, I mean, it just completely depends on. We have so many hops now in the closet. I feel like El Dorado plays really well as a baseline hop. Again, I think Mosaic as well, and I do notice that there can be some late pick dank Mosaic that doesn't express well. That I would also agree works better on the hot side. But and then the New Zealand hops. In the early days they were so expensive and so rare that I could only afford to kind of the little salt and pepper at the end. And now that we have our hands on larger quantities of them, I always work in a blend, so they're never going to be a predominant part of the blend unless I'm really trying to make like that beer we had last night at the pub, Vinny's New Zealand R&D beer. Oh man, beautiful expression, and I'd love to see what that recipe looked like. But
yeah, the New Zealand hops are one of the more interesting varietals to approach, and we've got a beer out, like one of our limited releases that's just coming out right now. That's a blend of all Southern Hemisphere. So Galaxy from Australia, Pacific Jade, and Nelson from New Zealand, and it just has a really interesting way of putting all those hop flavor and aromas together. I don't know, do you guys ever get this on the aromas of really Southern Hemisphere forward beers, Dirty Sock? I get on a lot of those beers, the aroma's like Dirty Sock, but it doesn't taste that way, fortunately. But
I always say Sexy BO. That's my.
Okay. That might be a better line, Ben.
Sexy BO, like Dead Tour BO?
No. There's like a patchouli influence there.
I'll often refer to it as sweaty or locker room or something like that, which, that's actually, it sounds kind of gross, but yeah.
But the approach that we've used is really trial and error more than anything else in terms of putting together which hops are in the base and which ones are your finishing notes by playing around with different combinations and layering the flavors together.
We got a question from Ken Grossman.
A couple of comments, as somebody briefly touched on oxidation concerns with dry hopping post-fermentation. Go back to touch the celebration man, so we always dry hop that with whole cone hops, and the only way you could not get that was to put it in during mid-fermentation. So our protocol was always start brewing and open fermenter initially, and then transfer on to the hops in a brewing vessel with at least one plate of extract, make sure that we can do a good job of scrubbing up that oxygen.
So celebration was always dry hops during a little bit active for controlling oxidation, doing it so much earlier than everybody else, like they do with everything. Of course. Yeah. Right.
Yeah, that's how we approach those late additions where the fermentation is really pretty much finished. I mean, there's still plenty of active yeast in there. But once we cool it off, we put all of our hop products, whether it's T90 pellets or cryo, in an external vessel. We purge that really thoroughly with CO2, and then we flow the beer through that vessel and back into the tank and do a gentle recirculation for a little while to get it all blended together.
Do you have any other tricks for reducing potential oxygen ingress when dry hopping?
Nothing that's groundbreaking. No.
Sure.
Yeah, we're using a hop cannon, so we have the opportunity to purge that pellet material out. But I'm still a big fan of getting the hops in earlier, for that oxygen control. So I'd like to see some yeast activity when there's some dry hopping going on. Yeah.
I'm curious if any of you are taking a approach to pH control before dry hopping, as well, adjusting acidifying. If you found that difference in comparing for that.
The question is pH control.
On the cold side? Yeah, at Firestone, we haven't been practicing that, but of course we see the same thing everyone else does with this, depending on how much we're dry hopping, and sometimes it can be variety specific, this increase in pH after dry hopping, and sometimes in that kind of danger zone above 4 or 5 that we really don't want to be at, but I haven't gone to the point of correcting that back down below, 4 or 5.
Yeah, we're in the same boat. I actually think there's, I guess, this camp that suggests that like beers, as they get a little bit higher pH, whether in this 4.6, 4.7 range, with heavy dry hops or drink flabbier, or there's concerns about diacetyl reduction. I actually find from a mouthfeel point of view that if other things are in check and balance, I prefer beers with a slightly higher finishing pH, like the 4.5 beers to me, or 4.4 can be a little bit like rougher in terms of bitterness when they're dry hopped that high. So I actually think that like a 4.6 beer, food safety questions kind of set aside, I think that like I push back against the notion that higher pH leads to inevitably a flabbier finishing beer. But yeah, we also just have not really seen our beers creep up that high. And I think actually another piece of this too, and is maybe with the use of additional cryo, we're seeing a little bit less pH change, and also lower finishing fan in the beers. So I think there's maybe some stability bits from that help.
Yeah, and talk about that a little bit. Free amino nitrogen and the impact on longevity. What do you do because you all are all making beer that goes into package that has to, get to customers in good shape. You can't guarantee that it's always going to be cold stored at every, as much as you might want that. What techniques do you use to make sure that hop character doesn't just taste great on day 1, but also tastes great on day 60?
Oxygen control. I mean, that's what we've always focused on, and I still feel like we make pretty delicate beers. What's really interesting, having done a little bit more work recently with Boulevard Brewing Company, is oxygen scavenging yeast, using bottle conditioning, or at least getting some active yeast in finished package to help control oxygen and longevity of the packaged goods. So I think there's a few old school brewers tricks that can help you. I haven't focused as much on this fan issue, so I can't really speak to that. But I think that in our brewery, it's like everything, attention to detail from the front end to the back end. So if we're making really clean wort with, grain that's coming in at the specs that we're asking for, we got our yeast in really good shape, and, we're pitching and really paying attention to good fermentation, and then oxygen control all the way to the finish line has always been, the way we make beer the best. And we taste it in long-term sensory studies. When we really performed on the front end, the beer is tasting really good longer on the back end.
What Matt said. We haven't looked at fan in our brewery for finished beer.
We have Ken in the room, so I would love to ask.
Yeah. And what Charlie Bamforth said is time and temperature. That's the other thing that we look at. So we place a really strong emphasis on cold supply chain through the market, which is very difficult to achieve. But from day one, that was something that we weren't going to compromise on. And, so the fresher you consume your beer, and if you keep it cold the whole way, that's going to do a lot to protect all the effort and the ingredients that went in on the front end.
What are you doing on fan, Ben?
We've spent the last couple of years looking at fan, starting with wort fan, and then fan at terminal gravity, package fan, and then the Delta fan after dry hop. I think I got into this mainly, I was probably listening to an MBAA podcast where it might have been Joe Hertrich or someone was talking about fan uptake was a indicator that AB used for many number of years as a kind of key indicator for yeast health. And so I kind of ran with that idea, and we started talking about that internally as beyond viability, what are we really looking at as far as assays go? And so fan uptake has been something we really have try and use a predictive, we try and predict what we think that fan uptake is going to look like, and that's kind of the first key to a healthy fermentation for us beyond viability. And cell count, of course, and all the other pieces that go into it. So it's part of the puzzle. But you see this huge delta, right, or this increase in fan and finished beer with dry hopping. And so at first we were uncertain is it about total value? Is the total number at the end of the day that you want to be looking at? Is it something, does that make a difference? Or is it about the delta between, end of fermentation and the time you're in package with the dry hop addition? Because one thing that's not happening during hop creep, we're not seeing any diminishment of that added fan. So the yeast isn't taking it back up. It's just sitting in that finished beer. We just see actually it increases over the course of several days. So if we dry hop on day 6, the fan will be increase on day 6, day 7, kind of peaks out and plateaus at that point. There's a great ASBC paper about this that was out, I think, last year too, that kind of validated a lot of these numbers that we were seeing from a third party. Anyhow, where we have gone, or where our current hypothesis is that it's not a total value. This beer that has, a 4.5 pound or 3.5 pound per barrel dry hop is pretty high fan number in package, but it actually holds on pretty well because if we get that initial number down. So we're really focused on kind of having as not zero residual fan, that's not possible, but a low residual fan number at the time we dry hop. And then we're less concerned about what that delta looks like. That said, using cryo does seem to also make that delta smaller. So it may just be that there's less fan in those advanced or kind of further concentrated pellets.
I think we probably have time for one more question if anyone has one.
Can I say a little bit about the last last beer?
Oh yeah.
We haven't
Double
talked about
Sunshine. I've already finished it.
I have a lot of stories about this beer that have nothing to do with the ingredients of the process. So if you want to hear some of those, find me at the social hour. But it kind of built our brewery from the beginning. It was a beer that, one day I was a one-man show for years, and I was delivering beer down at the Warren store, the only retail outlet, and people were lined up outside the store. It's a different era of craft beer back then. And I'm asking the guys at the front, I'm like, where are you guys from? They're like, we're from Chicago. We drove here overnight. I'm like, you guys are crazy. So this one has a lot of different malts. I had to pull it up to see. And my approach here was really about building layers of flavor. So I started with North American pale malt, some European pills to lighten it up, the base malts. So use a little bit of acidulated to get the pH just right without any other additives to the brew with our water profile. And then just a real light touch of the lightest color carapils, both for flavor and dextrin. And which variety you use, I'm not gonna give up that one because it's my favorite carapils. But you can experiment around with different ones, and some of them add a lot more color than others. So I was going for the lightest color and the highest dextrin addition, some special aromatic Vienna, and then just a little light touch of English caramel too. And then really Citra is the star of the party. When I started out in 2008, it was both the advent of these really fun fruit-forward hops and also a hop crisis. So as a small brewer new to the scene, it was very hard to get hops, and thankfully I wisened up and got a contract right away, even as a one-barrel brewery, to make sure I had enough Citra, especially a couple of years later as we were planning to scale up the beer, and Sip of Sunshine was born. And so do a double dry hop or 2-stage on this approach, one mid-fermentation and one after it's been cooled and cleaned up a little bit. But you'll notice it's got more of a little bit more a hint of an orange or amber. And I mean, this was a beer that used to be considered kind of a little hazy, but it's pretty clear these days. So and then back to the question.
Oh,
so
no, sure,
yeah,
sure.
yep.
I just wanted to ask, when you dry hop, do you just let it up sitting there for a week, or do you find that if you agitate it somehow you get a bit more out of it? And how do you agitate it?
We are generally with our like 120 barrel tanks, our dry hops are quiescent. Like we don't do any additional rousing. On some of the small fermenters at the pubs, we do. My theory there is that the liquid column, we see enough contact as it percolates down through the liquid column that we're getting the aromatics that we want. This is enough contact time. On the smaller tanks, I am concerned that we don't get that. We've done some sensory stuff on it, work on it, but have never really confirmed it. But I do feel like when we recirculate and have tried that, there's too many negative. We may get more intensity of aroma, but I found that we get too much pickup of undesirable attributes from hops as well. But that's just personal preference.
Vinny will argue about that with you, and you can see his techniques on the tanks as you guys take this tour. That's great.
Yeah, it's very beer specific for us, and we've changed our minds on this a few times over, but these mid-fermentation hops is kind of perfect because you have natural convection mixing with the fermentation, so that's nice. And then the later dry hops, we've definitely played around with doing some CO2 bursts, but from a consistency standpoint, you're doing a little bit of scrubbing, you're doing some mixing. So I'm not sure I'm a huge fan of that, but we have done that, and it kind of depends. Unfortunately, back in the day when pellet quality wasn't as good and we got these a little more case hardened pellets, they would just fall to the bottom of the tank and not, break up. And then we almost were forced to do some mixing. And these days, I think most of the pellet plants are producing these really nice soft pellets in a soft pack, and they tend to break up a little bit better. And as a result, require less mixing and less farting around with the beer like that.
Yeah, similar approach. It depends on the size of the tanks. So the smaller tanks, pub size, 7-barrel, we'll do a little bit of rousing with CO2, no recirculation. The bigger tanks, 80 and up, we'll do a recirculation right when we add the hops. Try to do it as gently and for as short a period of time. So like an 80-barrel tank will be less than half an hour, but like a 600-barrel tank will be, about an hour.
On those really big tanks, if you don't get any type of rousing, is there any issues with stratification where certain areas get more contact?
I think the least control that you have is over temperature stratification, and so it's really hard to control. When you recirculate, that homogenizes, so you get a more consistent temperature throughout. But on a tank that big, I find the smaller tanks that get better dry hop impact than those really large tanks. But we have achieved a really good measure of consistency. So that's the key, is that it's as close to the previous batch and the next one and your desired results.
Cool. Well, I think that's going to bring this to a close. Well, thank you guys for joining and talking about West Coast IPA.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for listening in on this panel on brewing West Coast IPA. This is the last of our 3 Brewers Retreat panels, and I hope you've enjoyed this entire series. Lots of incredible information and experience at play in every one of these 3 panels that we've shared to you. As I've said in past episodes here, we don't have plans for the next Brewers Retreat, but if you want to stay on top of what our plans do become and evolve into, then join our email list. You can go over to beerandbrewing.com and then subscribe to our newsletter to stay on top of that if you're not already subscribed. And if you're not, I mean, really, why aren't you already? Anyway, in the meantime, G&D Chillers has set the standard on quality, service, and reliability with 24/7 service and support. BSG gives you the freedom to explore a world of flavors, but at local prices. Try Old Orchard's flavored craft juice concentrate blends in your next craft beverage. Detect problems before they ruin a batch with the AccuBrew system. ProBrew's rotary can fillers achieve precise and consistent filling volumes. USWaterSystems.com builds American-made water treatment systems with brewers in mind. Twin Monkeys offers customizable packaging solutions for every craft. Discover the soft lager range from Fermentus for all your lager needs. And ABS Commercial is your full-service brewery outfitter. As always, please subscribe. Go to beerandbrewing.com, click on that subscribe button, become a subscriber. Let us know that this content matters to you and help us keep bringing it to you week after week after week. It is your subscriptions that make this podcast possible. And that's all I've got for this week. We'll be back next week. We've got a great episode with Justin Burt of Ghost Town as we talk more and more about brewing awesome, killer, award-winning, medal-winning West Coast IPAs. Until then, cheers. This podcast has been brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those who love to make and drink great beer. To learn more or to subscribe, visit beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew.